everyone. Welcome to the International Spy Museum Women of World War II lecture. My name is Hannah Soloyo. I am the Adult Education Experience Developer of the International Spy Museum. We want to welcome our members and our volunteers. Thank you guys for taking the time out of your day to spend this time doing a lecture with us. Please forgive us if you hear noise in the background. As you know, we're broadcasting from our living rooms. So if you hear any noise, it's children, dogs, ambulances. It's just the world we're living in. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Amanda Ohlke, who is the Director of Adult Education at the International Spy Museum, also known as my boss and the resident guru of women spies. So Amanda, take it away.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate your taking time out of your day to spend some time with us. And boy, do I wish that I was with you live. I miss everybody. Gosh, do we miss the museum. This is a talk that I gave way back at the beginning of March when you could actually gather people together. And I developed it for the Alexandria Library. And so every slide, I'm going to talk about 12 different women spies. And in each one, I have a recommendation for a book. And I thought, well, that's probably still going to work really well based on all of us being shut in right now. So without further ado, I'm going to get started. So this is the movie poster, Carve Her Name with Pride. This is from a 1958 film. I have not seen it. I don't even know who Virginia McKenna is, but it was such a gripping image. And it is the story, the film depicts the story of Violette Szabo. And some of you may remember Violette Szabo was in the old Spy Museum. Her photo is so striking, and she kind of sticks with you. She really looks like a Hedy Lamarr, some sort of glamorous woman of the 1940s. Really, really interesting young woman. Her mother was French, her father was English. She bobbed around between France and England as a child, and when war broke out, the family was in England, and the Free French forces were parading in London on Bastille Day, and her mother said, go get an officer and bring him, or a soldier, and bring him home for some good French cooking. Can you imagine this lucky soldier that has this gorgeous, 18-year-old girl approach him? And she's very shy, but she brought home a lovely man, and they ended up marrying. And unfortunately, he was killed soon after in action at the Battle of Alamein in October of 1942, and he never even saw their little tiny daughter, who was only a few months old. Now, Violet was very young, and although she had this little tiny child, she was recruited by the SOE. The SOE, the Special Operations Executive, was created by Churchill in 1940, and I'm sure you may all know that their mandate was to set Europe ablaze, and they truly did. They did sabotage, reconnaissance, and support of the French resistance. So Violette Szabo was trained, and I thought you might be interested in hearing some comments from her initial training report. A quiet, physically tough, self-willed girl of average intelligence, out for excitement and adventure, but not entirely frivolous, has plenty of confidence in herself, and gets on well with others, plucky and persistent in her endeavors, not easily rattled. In a limited capacity, not calling for too much intelligence and responsibility, and not too boring, she could probably do a useful job, possibly as a courier. Now, she was really quite a thrill seeker, very young. She did aircraft drops and drops from balloons. She was ready to go, and she had this incredible, hatred for the Germans after, they had killed her husband. They had denied her daughter a father. So she was first sent to occupied France in April of 1944. She was sent as a courier, and she helped reestablish a resistance network in Rouen. And they did a really great job. They were brought back to England, and you know, she was ready to go for another mission very soon. So in June of 1944, she was back behind enemy lines in France. And the goal this time was to connect resistance fighters to disrupt behind the German line. And this was going to be in support of the D-Day invasion. They were going to cut telegraph lines, sabotage railroad lines, you know, blow up roads and bridges. And so on June 10th of 1944, they were going out to connect, she and her teammates, and they knew they were going to be passing through some German checkpoints. And oddly enough, first of all, she requested a gun. Now, if you're going through a German checkpoint, you're going to want to look as unsuspicious as possible. A gun is not a good way to do that. Secondly, she didn't even go for like a little gun that would fit in a purse or a pocket. She asked for a Sten gun, which is a large submachine gun. I think that her goal that day was to kill some Germans. This was not anything you could hide. Well, indeed, they were stopped and they laid down spray. You know, she definitely took out some Germans. Her colleague, she helped a colleague survive and get away. There were injuries. She ended up being captured by the Nazis. And it was really a grueling experience. She was interrogated harshly, supposedly giving up no information. She was moved around a bit, and there is a story of her being on a train with fellow prisoners, and it is derailed. And she and several other women, rather than trying to take the chance to escape, they were nursing prisoners who were injured, and it was remembered by a SOE colleague who recognized her. She ended up in the Ravensbrück women's camp, and very sadly was executed by gunshot at age 23. So imagine all the living that this young woman did. And these are her medals that are on display in the middle of the screen. They recently went to auction. And then this really breaks my heart. There is her little daughter, Tanya, wearing the medals that were, of course, rewarded posthumously. She received the George Cross and the Croix de Guerre. And I want to say now, any of my pronunciations that are terrible, please forgive me. I am not the most linguistically agile with foreign terms, but I'm doing my best. And here is a book that her daughter wrote about her mother. Violette or Violet, The Missions of SOE Agent Violette Szabo. So let us move on to a woman very dear to my heart. I'm hoping you all have seen the Noor Inayat Khan area in our World War II gallery on the 4th floor of the new museum. I dearly love Noor. She's such a fascinating story. A young woman who has a sort of an amazing origin story. Her mother was from New Mexico. Her father was an Indian, a Sufi Muslim spiritual leader and musician. He was from India. He was the descendant of the Sultan of Taipei, so Indian royalty. And her parents met when her father was touring with his wonderful band, who actually backed up Mata Hari in Paris at one point. And he met her mother, whose family was interested in spiritualism. They married. So she's half American. She was born in Moscow, raised in Paris. They were a wonderful family, loving family, very musical, very artistic. She's the kind of girl that saw flowers at the edge of the garden, very tender spirit, did lovely watercolors, wrote this book, which is still in print, 20 Jataka tales. And these are traditional tales that she has updated, to be read today, meaning her day in the 1930s. And we have an older copy of this on display, and we're hoping to have a copy that everybody can look at when we get those doors back open at the Spy Museum. So that's still in print. So she received a degree in child psychology from the Sorbonne, and then, you know, war broke out, and she broke off an engagement that she may well have wanted to break off anyway, and her family headed to England, and there she ended up recruited by the SOE, and she's very musical, you know, played keyboards, and felt like this would help with her aptitude in being a radio operator. And I want to share we have selections from her training reports on display in the gallery, but one of them said she was inclined to give in when confronted with difficulties. Well, as you'll see, that is certainly not the case. They rushed her through training. They were desperate for wireless operators in occupied France, and in 1943, she was the first female wireless operator sent there. Unfortunately, most of her network had been compromised, and she was quickly alone. She was ordered to return to England, and she refused. The average span of time that a wireless operator would work in place in occupied France was about 6 weeks. She ended up operating for 3.5 months. And for 2 months, she was the only contact that the English had in occupied Paris. She spent her time evading the Nazis. She could never send a message from the same place. You had to keep moving because the Nazis could triangulate your location. She had this long wire antenna that you would have to spool out. I hope you have either tried it yourself or you will when the museum reopens. We have a suitcase shaped object, which gives you a sense of this case that she was carrying around, trying to look like a young lady, maybe with a phonograph or something. Meanwhile, it's a 35-pound case. It feels awful to lift it, at least to me. And but Keith Melton tells us it was a miracle of modern technology and considered so incredibly lightweight. And she did manage to convince some Nazis at one point that it was like cinemascopic material. So good for her for thinking quickly on her feet. Unfortunate, and she changed her look, she dyed her hair, she just kept moving, but unfortunately the Nazis did capture her. She escaped about 3 times, I think. She went out of bathroom windows, she went across roofs, she got out with another prisoner at one point, but tragically, they always collected her back. And she was moved through a series of kind of worse and worse concentration camps, and never gave up, you know, was harshly interrogated, tortured, never gave up any information. She was executed in Dachau in 1944, and her last word was apparently liberté. She is credited with helping 30 Allied airmen escape. She was posthumously, you know, awarded with citations, and her story was kept alive by a family friend, Jean Overton Fuller, who, along with Vera Atkins of the SOE, these were people who were really anxious to know what happened to these young women who had been lost. And so we have on display in the gallery actually some interviews that were conducted with German officers, and there are several of officers who remembered her during her imprisonment, and they were, you know, it's amazing. Here are the Nazis, and they were impressed with her, and she wouldn't give them anything, and what a noble figure she was. So that is Noor Khan. Spy Princess is really a very good book, and I highly recommend that. Let's go on to our old friend Virginia Hall. I'm sure everybody is familiar with her, and if you are interested in her at all and you haven't read Sonia Purnell's book, I would strongly recommend that. We had Sonia come in and talk last fall, and John and Mendez interviewed her. It was a terrific program. We had an audience, even though it was the first home game of the World Series. Go Nats. Anyway, those were fonder times. So Virginia Hall is a woman from Baltimore who really sought to work in the Foreign Service, had a very difficult time as a woman getting any traction. She shot her leg off in a hunting, or shot her leg in a hunting accident in Turkey as a young woman, and it had to be removed, so her chances grew slimmer. But the war gave her opportunities that peacetime did not. And she was the SOE's first female agent sent to France in 1941. And she operated out of Lyon undercover as a journalist. She was an American, so she had a good position to be able to rally the underground, and she was so effective. The Nazis were after the limping lady of Lyon. We know that she was just, undesirable #1. And then when the US entered the war, things got terrible and she had to flee occupied France. And she had to walk over the Pyrenees from France into Spain. She couldn't reveal to her guides that she had this prosthetic leg because they probably wouldn't have taken her. She'd have been too much of a risk. So she had to kind of snowplow her way over through these snowdrifts, over these mountains. And when she arrived in Madrid, the famous story is that, she got in contact with the SOE and they said, how was she? And she said, well, Cuthbert, which was her nickname for her leg, was giving her some trouble. And they said, well, then terminate him. So anyway, we always love that story about Virginia Hall and her sense of humor. Well, the SOE would not send her back to England, or sorry, send her back to France because she was so known and wanted by the Nazis. But enter the OSS. The OSS would send her. This is our Office of Strategic Services. This is American intelligence. It was begun in 1942 under the leadership of Wild Bill Donovan. And by 1944, the OSS had 13,000 members or operators, and a third of them were women. So Virginia switched over to the American side. She changed her looks. She went back to occupied France. This time we understand as in disguise as a milkmaid. She needed to cover that limp. She made herself look older. I believe she had her teeth. I'm not sure if this is true. She had her teeth worked on so they looked worse and like an older person's, like a peasant in France would. And she was sent as a radio operator in the Haute-Loire Valley region of France. And she was providing intelligence reports for the pre-D-Day invasion. She coordinated supply drops, sabotage missions. She rallied and organized the resistance. They destroyed 4 bridges, derailed freight trains, severed a key rail line in many places, downed telephone lines, killed 150 Germans, and captured 500 more. And she was really revered by these intense people who would not have given their allegiance easily. So really quite an extraordinary person. And after the war, she received the Distinguished Service Cross from Wild Bill Donovan, and she did it in his office quietly, as you see the photograph here. And that's because she wanted to go on and hopefully do clandestine missions. She did work for the CIA when it began. She didn't get to do much exciting stuff, which was too bad. And there's stories of her kind of coming to life when someone from the old war days would come in and plop down at her desk. When we did our program that I mentioned, we had quite a thrilling experience because She married a Frenchman that had worked with her during the war in the resistance, and they settled in Barnesville, Maryland, and a couple wheeled in a piece of luggage and took from it Virginia Hall's ambulance driver's uniform from the start of the war. And I can't tell you what goosebumps it gave me to see her jacket, and it had the label inside that said, you know, tailored for Virginia Hall by the English tailor in Paris, and her her cap. And believe me, we love to try to get that into the collection. So cross your fingers for us. Maybe that will happen for us one day soon. All right, Betty Macintosh, Elizabeth Macintosh. If you guys have been interested in women of the OSS at all, you've probably seen Sisterhood of Spies. And that is a book Betty wrote, gosh, 20 or 30 years ago. It's terrific. It talks about a lot of different people, including her friend Julia Child. Betty had a grew up in Hawaii, and she was a journalist. She learned she learned Japanese growing up in Hawaii, and she actually covered the Pearl Harbor attacks. She was there. And when we entered the war, she joined the OSS, and she had a really unique role. She was in morale operations, in Black propaganda. And so knowing Japanese helped us. She was creating materials that would influence Japanese feelings. And one of the operations was creating a believable document that would say it's okay to surrender, because the Japanese did not believe that surrender was an option or noble. And so she created this document that it was okay, you could surrender, and it was planted on a corpse in Burma, and it was forged Japanese government orders. She also, this is an interesting tie into our collection, because maybe you have seen in Sabotage, the explosive coal that we have. And she actually handed off some explosive coal once to, the operation was called Black Joe, and she handed some explosive coal off to a Chinese operative for the OSS, who put it on a train filled with Japanese troops. Got it sorted so it would blow up as it was going over a bridge. He jumped off to safety before that happened. She had a little bit of guilt about the loss of life, but not too much, because it was a war. And she also said she's not the one that put the coal on the train, but she just gave it to the guy who did. So Betty lived to be 100 years old. I met her a couple times at the Spy Museum. She spoke there probably about 15 or 16 years ago. Really, really amazing woman who really was as sharp as ever. And this is this book by Ann Todd is just a few years old, and Ann came and spoke, and it's really drills down on these interesting operations in Asia. And just a quick note on Julia Child, who was friends with Betty Macintosh, and Julia volunteered for the OSS in 1942, and I thought you'd get a kick out of the notes that the person interviewing her wrote. Good impression, pleasant, alert, capable, very tall. So that was kind of a no-brainer. She always downplayed what she did in the OSS, but in 1943, she developed a shark repellent. And this was used to keep sharks away from floating mines. If they didn't want to blow up sharks, they wanted to blow up enemy ships or subs. I've also heard it was to keep sharks away from divers who were planting these bombs, or a limpet mine or some such thing. After that piece of work here, she was deployed to Ceylon and later to China, and she tracked highly classified documents as a chief of the OSS registry. Now, she always said she was only a lowly file clerk, but she would see all the classified information coming in and out, had to keep her, keep all that confidential, and she received a citation for her work. And then this is a fairly recent book. This is about Julia and her husband, and she met him in the OSS. All right. Okay. Josephine Baker, someone that I have admired all my life. Really, really interesting woman. You may know her as the great entertainer. She entertained till literally the night before she died. She was a young and rather comedic performer on the circuit and through vaudeville, and she went to Paris with an early kind of a review of people of color. And when she got to Paris, she found out that life was a whole lot better in a country that didn't have the racist problems that she had found at home. So she stayed in Paris. She didn't disassociate herself from the United States, but she was not going to live there. And she had this incredibly exciting career, and she was in the Folies Bergère and everywhere else, and had her own review, and was just gorgeous and glamorous, and had, big cats, money cats, all kinds of, gorgeous things, really extraordinary, really beloved, a huge superstar. And also really an exciting personal life. She learned to fly, and when war broke out, she was ready to serve the French in any way she could. She used her contact with people, her access to stars, to prominent people, to diplomats, to gather information. She talked about there's smuggling things in her undergarments, information. She kept notes in invisible ink on her sheet music, which they would use to get, as they transported through countries during wartime. And as she said, no one would search the great Josephine Baker. She ended up in Africa. She was very ill quite a bit, and her hospital room in Africa was just in North Africa, was this kind of central point for intel gathering, for people to meet, for them to find out what was going on. And then whenever she was well enough, she would do these incredible fundraising shows for the Free France movement. And so when France was freed or she returned to Paris, one of her colleagues in the resistance said, "It was very nice of you to save France for us, Josephine." And de Gaulle had incredibly appreciated her support. And she received the French Medal of the Resistance in 1946. And de Gaulle personally thanked her for the enthusiasm which she put her magnificent talent at the disposal of our cause. She also received the Croix de Guerre. I don't know why that's so hard for me to say. And this photo in the center, this is her at the March on Washington. She's wearing all her medals, and she spoke briefly, and you can hear her speech online, and it's very moving. Just a really amazing woman. And the Hungry Heart, there are lots of books about her, and there's really lovely kids books about her. But she adopted children throughout her life and made friends, and Jean-Claude Baker wrote this. And that, The Hungry Heart, is a lot of fun to read because she is really something. All right, well, here's something totally else. Here's somebody really quite extraordinary. Amy Elizabeth Thorpe Pack, Betty Pack, codename Cynthia. Betty was an American. Her moved in diplomatic circles. As a young woman, she'd married an attaché in the English embassy here in DC. They lived abroad. She ended up working for the Brits. So she's an American working as an agent for the Brits here in the United States. She worked for the famous William Stevenson. He was the British Security Council leader here in the States, trying to get the States into the war, trying to do morale, see what's going on. And he says lots of interesting things about Betty Pack, that she was maybe on both sides in the Spanish Civil War, that there's stories of her involved with the Enigma machine. Those are not true. They have been debunked. But what we do believe, a very delightful story, is that in 1942, she stole the codes from the Vichy French embassy here in DC, and these codes helped the Allies with the invasion of North Africa. So that's really cool, except the exciting thing is how she did it. She had taken up with the press attaché at the Vichy French embassy, and they were very involved. And I think he must have been in on this whole thing, because they did something that in the spy world, they'll talk about developing a pattern of behavior. And this can lure the people who are surveilling you into a false sense of complacency. You just do the same things over and over again. So the thing that they did over and over again was frolic romantically in a place very near to the safe where the codes were kept. And this apparently was on the first floor of the embassy, and they just made it the pattern that was where they engaged in their lovemaking. So when they were actually going to crack the safe, she did it in the nude, and a staff person apparently did hear something and came down, but saw our operative Cynthia in the nude and said, oh, well, that's just those guys, they're at it again, and went away. And hence, this truly was an undercover mission. So Betty got the codes, if the story is to be believed. And after the war, she married the press attaché. So I think that's a lovely story. And as she said later, wars are not won by respectable methods. So let's see. All right, here is Claire Phillips. I had never heard of this spy until she was brought up as we were researching people to include in the new spy museum. She didn't make the cut, unfortunately, but that's all the more reason why I want to talk to you about her today. She's an American who had an incredibly crazy youth. She literally ran off to join the traveling circus. She worked in nightclubs. She toured East Asia in a musical stock company, and it was in the Philippines. She met a Filipino sailor, Manuel Fuentes, in a nightclub where she was performing. They married, they had a child, they divorced. She returned to the US, and then that was boring. This is a traveling circus kind of person. So back she went to the Philippines, and there she met her second husband, Sergeant John Phillips. And she met him in a nightclub, they married, and then during the invasion of the Philippines, her husband was captured in 1942. So the insurgents that were acting against the Japanese convinced her to work with them against the Japanese. So she created a new identity for herself as Philippine-born Italian dancer Dorothy Clara Fuentes. She and another woman created the Club Tsubaki, and this became a really popular spot for Japanese officers in Manila. You see a recreation of that down in the corner in a film later of the story. She ran the Miss U spy ring, and some of her info was used to predict and counter Japanese military activities. She also smuggled food, medicine supplies, and info to prisoners in the Cabanatuan prison camp. And this is where she got her nickname, High Pockets. And she would tuck her information into her high pockets, which I would probably call my bra. We thought this was very, very amusing. So she was High Pockets. She really dared all, and she was captured. She was interned in the Japanese prison camp Bilibid, and she was tortured. She was held in solitary confinement for 6 months, and she was actually supposed to be executed. And she was liberated by American forces near death from starvation in 1945. She went on, obviously survived and thrived. Sadly, it turned out her husband had died. She didn't know it at the time, but the military husband had passed away. She wrote a book about her experience. It was made into this movie, I Was an American Spy, and she received the Medal of Freedom in 1951. All right, now we're going to get to the bad guys. These were the good guys, but I thought I would wrap up the last few folks I would tell you about were bad guys. Stephanie von Hohenlohe. She was born a commoner. She married an Austrian prince. She had his child, who probably wasn't his child, but you know, if you can convince someone of that, she was able to do that. They divorced. She kept that princess title, moved to London. She mingled with high society, British, French, Americans, everybody, but she was strongly suspected of being a German spy. She had affairs with wealthy and connected men. And then she would take frequent trips to Germany, and she socialized with Himmler and with Göring and with Hitler. In the 1930s, she was awarded a gold medal by the Nazi Party. In a 1938 MI6 report, British intelligence said of her, "She is frequently summoned by the Führer, who appreciates her intelligence and good advice. She is perhaps the only woman who can exercise any influence on him." Well, when the U.S. declared war, joined the war, she fled. Sorry, I have messed that up. She fled to the U.S. when war was declared. After Pearl Harbor, she was arrested by the FBI and interned. They felt like she was too dangerous. Her connections were too strong to Hitler for her to just be loose and mingling in the public. And later, declassified documents revealed that the OSS used interviews with her to create a personality profile of Hitler. So here you see a photograph of her mingling with Hitler, and then that's also Goebbels is there, and that is Magda Goebbels sitting in front next to her. That is from January of 1936. All right, okay, Val Val Dickinson, the doll lady. This is such a gentle cover for a spy operation. Val Val was born in California, and she had close friends and interests with the Japanese community. In the 30s, she moved to New York, she and her husband, and she opened this doll shop that you can see a photograph of. And she then used correspondence to send information to the Japanese about war movements, ships appearing in the New York harbor, supplies, anything she could find out. And it's intriguing. She used it under, she shared this information under cover of doll correspondence. And she would indicate, you know, a hula dancer doll, and that meant this kind of ship. Really intriguing stuff. But how it all went wrong for Val Val was she was using the return addresses and the signatures of real people. Say I, Amanda Ohlke, bought a doll from her. She would then send to her contact in Buenos Aires a note with all this information about dolls, and it was signed with a signature that would have looked like mine, Amanda Ohlke, and the return address would have been Amanda Ohlke, blah, 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 Washington, D.C. So something happened to the contact in Buenos Aires, and some of the letters were returned to these people whose identities she'd assumed. They contacted the FBI. The FBI interviewed her. And it turned out she had $13,000 traceable to Japanese sources. They found these letters. They accused her. She insisted it had all been her husband's doing. She threw him under the bus big time. His doctor said that he had been too unwell to have undertaken anything like this. They found her connections to the Nippon Club, the Japan Institute. She had a friendship with the Japanese Consul General and the Japanese Naval Attaché from DC. She ended up being found guilty. She was sentenced to 10 years, fined $10,000. She was released in 1951. It was interesting, the judge was kind of like, people don't, I think he was soft on her as a woman because he said something like, people don't understand that, you know, this can be harmful to the US. I think when you're sharing information about battleships, you might know what you're up to. All right, now here's a bad guy that I didn't know anything about and kind of wish I hadn't, but now I'm gonna share Savitri Devi Mukherjee's story with you all. She was born Maximiana Julia Portis in France in 1905. She was a National Socialist. She became fascinated by Hinduism and in 1932 went to India, and she took the name Savitri Devi. She was a pro-Indian independence person. She was anti-Judeo-Christianity. She believed Hitler was an avatar of the Hindu god Vishnu. She distributed pro-access propaganda and gathered info on the British in India. She married a Bengali Brahmin named Asit Krishna Mukherjee, and he edited the pro-German newspaper New Mercury. And their social position enabled them to entertain Allied personnel, and they gathered intel which was passed on to Japanese intelligence officers and contributed to attacks on Allied air bases and army units. This woman lived until 1982. She was one of the early and very vocal Holocaust deniers. She was a supporter of the ongoing Nazi underground movement. And she has a ton of books that she wrote. I've included one here. There are a lot of things she wrote about. She is, it's interesting. She was the kind of ecology-minded person who feels like, you know, maybe even eating plants is maybe a bad thing. So she's just got ties into a lot of different areas, and she's had a resurgence, her writings, and in 2017, the BBC called her the mystical fascist being resurrected by the alt-right. So pretty fascinating and chilling. All right, this is our last spy, Mathilde Carré. She was born in France in 1910, and she was a nurse. When war broke out, her Polish lover, Roman Czerniawski, I'm sure I butchered that, he had established an intel network in Paris. And she was a recruiter and a courier. She took information to London. She flirted relentlessly with the Germans and got all sorts of intelligence. She had this incredible confidence in her sex appeal. She felt charm or seduce any man anywhere. And the Inner Ali network that they had set up was about to be supported by the SOE, but the Germans busted them in late 1941, and she was arrested, and she ended up being used as bait to roll up the rest of the Inner Ali network, and then engage with new agents sent by the SOE. So she went that route rather than be imprisoned. She worked with the Nazis, and eventually she was confronted and confessed to being a German agent to an SOE agent, Pierre de Vaucourt. So she said she was ready to spy again for Britain. Oh my. So to protect himself from her, he agreed to run her as a triple agent. So he convinced her that he believed she could be trustworthy, And he and she cooked up a plot in which they were going to go back to England and they were going to sell this to the Nazis by saying that there was an English general who wanted to come to France and do reconnaissance work, and they were going to go and get him. And this was how they were going to get safe passage to England. And the Germans were really excited by the idea of getting to capture an English general. So they let them go. And when they arrived in England, the British pretended to believe in her loyalty. They supported her. They thanked her for all her hard work. They got all the information they could out of her, and then they arrested her on the 1st of July, 1942. She was absolutely shocked. She couldn't believe it. She tried to seduce her way out of that as well, but that did not happen. She stood trial in France in 1945, and she was condemned to death, but was released in 1954. She wrote her memoir in 1959, and she died in 1970. So a triple agent-ish. All right, I'm gonna go, this is our last slide. And this is a nice book that has some thumbnail stories of some really cool women spies for Britain. And I am ready to take questions. I bet you guys are ready for me to stop talking. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Thank you, Amanda. I do have some questions for you. I'm going to keep your final slide up, though, just so everyone can look at it and not just us.
Awesome.
First question I have coming in, it sounds like most of these women come from a wealthier background. Was it easier to become a spy if you had money? And if so, why?
You know, that's such an interesting question. I think there, you know, some do and some don't, but I think the fact that you've got some mobility, you maybe are conversant with a variety of places, you speak different languages, you know, I think that is probably what, you know, why that happened. Certainly with the OSS, the nickname for the OSS was the Oh So Social. So they were certainly pulling from Ivy League people and, you know, who you know, and getting people involved, the friends of who you know. So I think there is definitely real validity to that observation.
Let's go on to one of the ladies. Let's see, Virginia Hall. Can you talk about more of the challenges she faced when offering to spy for her country?
Well, she didn't face any challenges offering to spy for her country. What the challenge, or later on she did, I should say, she faced challenges trying to work in the Foreign Service as a young woman. You know, she just wasn't wanted just because she was a woman. The challenges she faced later on after the war, it seems like she really just had desk jobs. They weren't putting her out in the field for, you know, unexciting missions. And I think a lot of women that we know from the early days of the CIA, you know, you could have a great education, but you were probably a secretary, and it was hard to move out of that role.
Let's switch gears. Let's see, Josephine Baker. Do you know when Josephine moved to Paris?
Oh my gosh, I meant to look that up. I would have to Google that, but it was in the 20s. She was very ensconced there because she was traveling with these, you know, these shows, and she was young, and she was a comedian. She was kind of we think of her as this beautiful, you know, exotic performer in these elaborate costumes, or not a lot of costumes, but she was like funny and wacky and eyes crossed when she started. She was kind of a clown.
Let's stick with some Josephine Baker. Someone is curious if her sheet music, if there are any examples of her sheet music still around. Do you have any of in our collection, in archives, or has it all been destroyed because of its sensitive nature?
You know, I don't know. We do not have any in our archives. I'm sure there's probably some of her sheet music somewhere, not necessarily with the invisible writing on it. We know about that from, I think that's cited in the book that I had up, written by Jean-Claude Baker. So, these are just, tales that she would tell. But, if you come across any, we'd sure like to have it.
If anyone out there has any, just send it our way, FedEx, straight to my house. Here's a great question for Noor. Do you believe that any racism or sexism was a factor in Noor's SOE review? They seem very harsh.
It's interesting. There were some really nice things that were said about her and some very sensitive things. One reviewer said she really understood what she was getting into. She didn't have she didn't have any of this Mata Hari, idea of it's, just going to be a jaunt. So interestingly, she was being compared to other women. They found she was a bit clumsy. It didn't really seem that racist, and it was only as sexist as, it was all, men reviewing other women. I have seen one suggestion that maybe there were harsh reviews because they really, certain people cared for her a lot and didn't really want her sent to the field because she seemed so tender. So I don't know. I think they were just really trying to, get down what they thought about how people would be operationally.
And this is going to be our last question because I know we are running out of time. But Amanda,
I spent a long time. Sorry.
It's okay. It was so fast. I hadn't heard about some of those women actually. I missed your lecture before. And this says, have you had a chance to see the recent episode of Doctor Who when Noor is featured? If so, what do you think of her portrayal?
I did watch that. I am a Doctor Who fan. I do not really love the current Doctor Who. So I watched it because I knew it was Noor, and I think it was okay. Looked a bit like her, seemed a bit like her, but I'm so distracted by how much I don't like the new Doctor Who that I can't give you a good answer. Sorry.
That's okay. Well, thank you, Amanda, for your wonderful lecture. For everyone out there, if you're looking for more virtual programs, I actually just sent the link in the chat. If you go to our Spy Museum website to our calendar, you'll see our upcoming lectures in virtual adult programs. That's going to include a trivia game tonight, as well as tomorrow we'll have two. One is called Curator's Corner, where our historian Vince Houghton will be sitting down with two former analysts to talk a little bit about the coronavirus and I guess an analyst's take on it. And tomorrow evening, there'll be a happy hour lecture with Mata Hari. It should be very exciting. Amanda will also be giving that lecture, so she's on double duty this week.
I'm not going to talk as long.
It'll be quick and short and kind of sweet to go with your Mata Hari cocktail. But thank you, everyone. I hope everyone enjoyed it. Thank you for all the lovely comments we had come in and all the questions. So thank you, everyone.
Bye. Be well. Be well. Take care.